Today on History You Should Know, the story that inspired Game of Thrones. And one of my most favorite stories in history. The fate of England and the Plantagenet dynasty rests on the shoulders of one of history's weakest kings. This is episode 1 of The Wars of the Roses. In all its glory! Kung hindi mo pa napapanood ang prequel, watch it now, then come back. Henry VI ruled England for quite literally all his life. Naging hari siya at 9 months old at lumaking napapaligiran ng advisors. They wanted to make sure he didn't show signs of tyranny, like the previous boy king, Richard II. In this case, tyranny meant killing people who are like them, nobles. Peasants, not a priority. Kadalasan sa history kapag may mahinang hari, napapaligiran siya ng mga corrupt na advisors. This was the perfect example because Henry lacked courage and was quite naive. Mas interesado siya sa religion kaysa sa gera, which is bad for a country constantly at war with its neighbor, France. But when Henry turned 23, his whole life changed when his advisors married him off to a 15-year-old French noble named Margaret of Anjou. Kung ano si Henry, siya ang kabaliktaran. She grew up being used to women in charge. Laging nasa gera ang tatay niya, kaya lola or nanay niya ang tagapamahala. She was a strong woman who comes from a family of decisive problem solvers. He completes her, I guess? But hers was the worst situation anyone in her family would ever get into. Nothing illustrates this dynamic between king and queen better than Crisis. In 1450, a group of peasants in London rebelled against the crown. Nasaan si Henry? Nowhere near London. Nasaan si Margaret? She stayed behind to quell the rebels, pardoning those who surrendered and executing those who didn't. But Margaret had her own problems. Noong medieval times, ang reyna, dalawa lang ang function. One, her marriage was to create a peace between nations. That was fulfilled for a short time. Two, was to produce an heir to the throne of her king. And this was her major problem. 8 years into their marriage, wala pa ring anak si Henry at Margaret. Some accounts say it's mostly because Henry had no idea how to make babies. Meron daw sex coach ang hari while they were trying to conceive. There was a guy right there saying, "Oh, this is how you do it, Your Majesty." Whew, awkward job. And in the age of all religion and very little science, Margaret would fast to ask God to give her a baby. And that greatly affected her ability to get pregnant. Meanwhile, in France, the English army was struggling to hold on. Hindi lang nauubusan ng pera ang England, natatalo pa. Isa sa mga pinsan ng hari, the Duke of Somerset, lost significant lands due to poor leadership and management skills. At higit sa lahat, umalis siya sa laban sa gitna ng kapabayaan at bumalik sa England. And one man was more frustrated than anyone. Siya ang pinakamayamang noble sa England, veterano at respetadong sundalo laban sa France, at pinsan ni Henry na si Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York. If you think about it, a senior noble like Richard should be advising or at least should be part of the parliament of Henry, right? You don't know Henry! During these difficult years, the Duke of York was put in charge of Ireland. Marangal na posisyon pero walang impact sa parliament ng England. At ang naglagay sa kanya doon ay ang pamumulitika ng Duke of Somerset. In short, Richard, Duke of York, hated the Duke of Somerset. But now that the war is going badly and the country is in trouble, Richard saw himself as the solution. He left Ireland for London with 5,000 men para kumbinsihin si Henry na gawin siyang chief minister. Para sa kanya, kailangang tanggalin ang mga corrupt at incompetent na nobles at panagutin sila sa mga kasalanan nila. But when he arrived at Parliament, Henry VI had already appointed a chief minister. The same man who lost in France and abandoned his post. Richard's arch-enemy, the Duke of Somerset. You don't know Henry. York declared Somerset a traitor and left London fuming and humiliated. Bukod sa pagiging mayaman, si Richard, Duke of York ang tagapagmana ng korona dahil wala pang anak si Henry at Margaret. In fact, in the medieval way of thinking, the Duke of York had a stronger claim to the throne than Henry VI himself. His ancestor was Lionel, the second surviving son of Edward III, while Henry's was John of Gaunt, the third surviving son. And remember, the House of Lancaster only won the crown by usurping it. If you're confused, watch the prequel episode on my page. At dahil nauubos na ang pera ng England sa giyera, si Richard ang nagpautang kay Henry to keep funding his army. Luckily for Henry VI, Richard was loyal to the crown for now. Ang Duke of Somerset naman, malakas ang impluwensya sa parliament. But the real ace up his sleeve was his very powerful ally, Margaret of Anjou. Ang problema ng reyna, wala siyang papel sa gobyerno. But through this alliance, she was able to influence certain decisions. After all, she was a very capable woman. So if you think about it, it's really a rivalry between Richard and Margaret. They just didn't know it yet. And so the humiliated Richard gathered a force outside London. These men also hated Somerset because they saw him responsible for the deaths of their fellow soldiers. And they had one goal: remove Somerset from power. Sinabihan ng hari si Richard na handa siyang makinig at patalsikin si Somerset kung i-disband niya ang army niya. That's what the Duke of York wanted, so he did. But when he arrived for the meeting, the Duke of Somerset was right there beside the king. Richard was forced to take a humiliating public oath in St. Paul's Cathedral to stay loyal to the crown and never raise an army against it. Civil war was avoided for now. In 1453, Queen Margaret finally became pregnant. The king and the queen were overjoyed because the line of succession would finally be secure. Plus, it's much needed good news after that tense encounter with Richard. But good news in this story never lasts long. Makalipas ang ilang buwan, England lost their last piece of land in France. Lahat ng sinakop ng Plantagenets ng mahigit 100 taon nawala sa ilalim ng pamumuno ni Henry VI. In the same year, Henry VI suffered a complete mental collapse. He became catatonic. Hindi siya makapagsalita at hindi nagre-respond. Lagi lang siyang tulala. Some modern experts say it was a psychotic break. Some say catatonic schizophrenia. Pero kung ano man yun, it meant one thing. England had an incapacitated king, which meant England now had a power vacuum. And two people were about to try to fill the void: the pregnant Queen Margaret of Anjou and the angry Richard, Duke of York. The red rose of the House of Lancaster looked more vulnerable than ever. The white rose of the House of York was eager to bloom. And something that seemed improbable now looked inevitable. It's family versus family, the wars of the roses. Liking the series so far? Well then, follow for more, and boom! Now you know.